Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into a world where fierce warriors didn't just raid villages and conquer lands. They also invented something we still use today. And no, I'm not talking about the Viking longships or the horned helmets, because, spoiler, those are mostly myths. I'm talking about the very first business cards. And yes, you probably won't survive this. You'd have to be a skilled merchant or someone with a lot of charm to get by in the Viking world. So grab your imaginary rune-carved business card and let's step into their shoes. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Don't forget to post your location and local time in the comments. It's always fun to know where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine, for a moment, you're a Viking in the 9th century, ready to embark on a journey, not to raid, but to trade. You don't have Instagram, LinkedIn, or email. So how do you introduce yourself? How do you make a lasting impression when the person across from you speaks a different language, lives in a completely different culture, and might never see you again after this exchange? Well, the Vikings had their own method, an early version of the business card. The idea of business cards might feel modern, but the Vikings had something very similar, just with a lot more stone carving, runes, and symbolic gestures. Instead of handing over a piece of paper with a shiny logo and a catchy tagline, Vikings would use what could be considered a personal seal, often inscribed with their name or a symbol of their identity. These items weren't just pieces of art. They were powerful tools of recognition, a quick way to say, "This is who I am, and I mean business." Historians still argue whether these seals functioned in the same way as a modern business card, but there's no doubt they played a key role in Viking networking, and that's what made them so interesting. They didn't just symbolize personal identity, they carried weight, importance, and, at times, magical properties. Viking society was deeply intertwined with the need for personal honor, reputation, and connections. If you wanted to negotiate with another clan or seal a trade deal, your seal was your introduction, your reputation, and your guarantee of trustworthiness, all wrapped up in one. Imagine having that kind of weight in your back pocket. Not just a fancy design, but something that could change the outcome of your day. But let's step back a bit. Before we start thinking of Viking business cards as just stylish accessories, let's look at the bigger picture. Trade in the Viking world wasn't just about exchanging goods. It was about relationships. It was the social glue that held everything together. And just like in any networking scenario, how you presented yourself mattered. Vikings, known for their raids, also formed vast trading networks that spanned from Scandinavia to the Middle East and across to North America. In those distant lands, they needed ways to communicate, to assert authority, and to prove their trustworthiness to other merchants and leaders. It's here in the hustle of Viking trade routes that the first business cards came into play. Now, these weren't printed on cardstock, obviously. The Vikings used a very different medium: wood, bone, leather, or metal. They would carve runes into these materials. Runes that signified a personal mark or symbol. The most famous examples were the Viking seals, small but intricate carvings of personal symbols, or even the owner's name. Historians argue about the exact purpose of these seals. Were they a way to mark ownership or property? Were they simply decorative? Some believe these symbols also acted as a kind of passport, guaranteeing safe passage and trustworthy trade on the high seas. Perhaps when Vikings traveled from one market to the next, their personal seal would be recognized and respected by those who knew the symbolism or were familiar with the history behind the seal. Now, picture yourself as a Viking trader in the bustling market of Birka, a key trading post in Sweden. You walk through rows of merchants peddling everything from fur to amber to silk. To make your mark, you don't just shout about your goods. Instead, you display your personal seal. This tells everyone, I'm trustworthy, I'm established, you can count on me. It's your business card without the glitz, but even more than that, it's a symbol that holds your reputation and trustworthiness in high regard. You see, back then, a reputation wasn't something you could easily fake. The Vikings didn't have LinkedIn endorsements or Yelp reviews to vouch for their skills. Instead, your seal, or the mark you left behind, spoke volumes. It was your personal guarantee of integrity. As we journey deeper into the Viking world, remember that these personal seals weren't just about business. They were about identity, power, and culture. Every Viking knew that their name carried weight, and their symbols were their legacy. And in this world, making a good first impression meant more than getting a deal done. It meant survival as you continue your journey through the Viking world. Let's take a step back and imagine the environment in which these early business cards thrived. The Vikings, despite their fearsome reputation, weren't just raiders. They were master networkers. Their way of life required them to form connections across vast territories, from the icy shores of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of Constantinople. And just like today, making a good first impression was crucial. Now, think of a Viking market, a chaotic, lively place where every merchant, trader, and even raider had to find a way to distinguish themselves. The trade routes they frequented were filled with people of all backgrounds, speaking different languages and carrying different customs. You might be dealing with an Anglo-Saxon in one moment and a Byzantine in the next. So, how did you quickly signal your credibility, your personal seal? It wasn't just about the goods you carried. It was about the reputation you could represent. With a few swift marks in this section, we'll look at how Vikings forged and maintained these personal connections, and how these early business practices mirrored modern networking. A lot of it came down to one key element: trust. The Vikings were traders. Sure, But above all, they were people for whom reputation meant everything. To succeed in their world, they had to establish trust quickly and solidly. Historians still argue whether the Vikings were as corporate in their dealings as modern-day businesses. But one thing is certain: the Vikings knew that forging strong relationships was the bedrock of a successful trade. If you weren't trusted, your goods wouldn't move, your ships wouldn't get passage, and your name would fade into the shadows of forgotten traders. So, let's talk about the mechanics of Viking social life and how they made their way in the world without LinkedIn profiles or email signatures. The Viking social scene, at first glance, may seem like a world of brawn, battle, and blood. However, beneath the surface, there was a finely tuned network of alliances, friendships, and reciprocal favors that shaped Viking trade and politics. Vikings didn't just raid for the thrill of battle. They also raided for the valuable goods they could trade, the wealth they could acquire, and the connections they could make. Picture yourself at a Viking feast. It's loud, with the clatter of mead-filled mugs and the sounds of laughter echoing off the wooden walls of the longhouse as you exchange stories with your fellow warriors and traders. You're also exchanging more than just pleasantries. You're sizing each other up, judging how useful an alliance with this person could be down the road. You're watching for signs: who speaks the loudest, who makes the best trade deals, and who carries that all-important seal on their gear or belongings. Just like today, the Vikings knew that reputation was everything. If you were known as an honest trader or a fearless warrior, it was much easier to make your way through the tough world they inhabited. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Viking symbols and seals weren't only for business transactions, they were also a key part of their social structures. Vikings didn't have the concept of a business card in the way we know it today, but they did have a social currency that worked much in the same way. The exchange of a personal mark could symbolize everything from an agreement made to an oath taken. It was the equivalent of saying, "I'll call you when I need you," except much more permanent and with far more serious consequences if it wasn't honored. You might have noticed by now that we've been talking a lot about trust. Well, it's not just a modern concept. Vikings were acutely aware of how fragile their reputations could be. If a Viking seal was used in bad faith, it could lead to social exile, or worse, violence. You might think it sounds a little extreme, but in a world where life could be cut short by the wrong enemy, your seal was more than a symbol. It was your lifeline. Let's talk about the practicality of these Viking social interactions. You're a Viking trader traveling from Norway to the far reaches of the Eastern Roman Empire, stopping in places like Constantinople. Here, people are familiar with all sorts of traders, from Arabic merchants to Frankish traders. To ensure your presence is noted, your seal would be presented. The moment it was laid down on a parchment or carved into a piece of wood, you had entered into a Chiland contract. It was as if you were saying, "I'm not just a random face here. I'm someone who's built relationships, maintained them, and I'll keep my word. This is where the value of the Viking seal really shines. It wasn't just a mark, it was a promise. The Viking world, like the modern one, wasn't just about raw power. Sure, they had their raids and their battles, but the true power often lay in the ability to create lasting bonds and make deals that worked in everyone's favor. So, imagine if you had that seal in your pocket as you moved between trade hubs. What doors would it open for you? What promises would it symbolize? The Viking world knew, perhaps more than anyone else at the time, that relationships were the foundation upon which everything else stood. The more we dig into this, the more fascinating it becomes. The idea of trust, reputation, and social connection isn't just an abstract concept. It's as old as the Vikings themselves, and the tools they used to establish these things, the runes and the seals, may have seemed like small acts of daily life, but they laid the groundwork for the networks that make up the world of business today. As you continue to sink deeper into the Viking world, let's explore the fascinating power behind the written word, or more specifically, the symbols that made these early business cards so effective. To truly understand the Viking social network, we need to look at the root of their written language, runes. Picture this. You're a Viking merchant traveling through a thick forest, the air cool and crisp around you. As you head toward a distant trading post, in your pack, you carry small wooden tokens, each one carved with intricate symbols. The runes. These symbols aren't just decorative. They hold meaning, power, and function. The word rune itself comes from an ancient word that means secret or mystery. And indeed, the runes were more than just a primitive written language. They were a bridge to a deeper, more mystical world, one where your mark held not just value, but significance. Historians still argue about the exact purpose and origin of runes, but it's clear that for the Vikings, these symbols had immense weight. Some scholars suggest that runes were primarily used for communication and recording events, while others believe they were part of ancient magical practices. Regardless of their exact use, what's undeniable is their role in establishing the Viking identity, and thus their personal seals. Imagine you're in a bustling Viking marketplace with people all around, shouting and trading. A Viking trader walks up to you, handing over a small piece of wood, a carved token with a few runes etched into its surface. This is no ordinary token. It's a seal, a carefully crafted piece of personal identification, telling you that this person is trustworthy and established within their community. In this moment, it's as though you're being handed a contract, sealed in the language of the gods. Runes weren't just functional. They were steeped in deep cultural significance. Each rune was more than a letter. It was a symbol that carried with it meaning and intention. When you carved your rune, you were marking yourself as part of a greater story, a connection to the divine and the mystical. To carve a rune was not just to communicate, it was to make a statement, to imbue your personal seal with something beyond mere identity. It was a way to ensure that your name, your reputation, and your promise carried weight in the world of trade. Now, let's dive a little deeper into the history of runes. The oldest known runic inscriptions come from around the 2nd century CE, and these early runes were primarily used by Germanic tribes long before the Vikings emerged. Over time, however, the Vikings adapted and refined this system to suit their needs, creating what we now refer to as the Younger Futhark, which was much simpler and more efficient for their purposes. This simplified alphabet was more than just a tool for writing. It became a cultural cornerstone, used to mark everything from tombstones to weapons and, of course, personal seals. Historians still argue whether runes were always seen as magical symbols. Some scholars believe that these characters were imbued with mystic properties. Perhaps they had the power to bring good fortune, ward off evil, or even curse an enemy. And in some ways, this mystical aspect might explain why runes were so highly valued as part of Viking trade and personal identification. When you handed over a rune-inscribed seal, you weren't just passing a simple symbol. You were offering a piece of your very identity, and you hoped that it carried the protection and power of the gods themselves. In Viking society, a name carried great importance. Your name wasn't just a label. It was a representation of your ancestry, your achievements, and your reputation. Your seal, with its runic carvings, was a tangible manifestation of that legacy. The name and symbol you carried were an unspoken contract. It was as if you were saying, I come from a long line of trusted traders, respected leaders, and honored warriors. My seal is my promise that I will uphold these values. Now, what makes the Viking seals so interesting is not just their practical use, but their ability to convey information without saying a word. You didn't need to explain who you were. Your seal did that for you. It was the ancient equivalent of a business card with a logo that could be instantly recognized by those in the know. Imagine walking through a Viking marketplace, and instead of shouting your name to attract attention, you simply present your seal instantly. Those around you understand who you are, where you come from, and whether they can trust you. It's as if your entire identity was distilled into a simple, carved symbol. And perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this system is how it transcended the idea of personal ownership. These seals weren't just used to signify that you owned a particular piece of land or goods. They were about relationships, about trust, and about the social bonds that held Viking society together. Whether you were selling furs, amber, or even slaves, the credibility of your seal was what made or broke your deal. As you reflect on this, you might begin to realize how much these early Viking business practices resemble our modern day. Think about the power of your LinkedIn profile or the weight of a well-designed business card. They serve much the same purpose: to establish trust and credibility in an instant. The Vikings, in their own way, were laying the groundwork for these very practices, using their runes and personal seals as the original business cards. So next time you hand someone your business card, remember, you're carrying on a centuries-old tradition of the Vikings, who knew that reputation and trust could be the most valuable currency of all. Now that we've seen how the Vikings used runes to establish themselves in the world of trade and networking, let's zoom in on the most influential figures in Viking society, chiefs. These were the people who held the keys to not only military power, but also the ability to dictate the flow of goods, influence political relationships, and, of course, shape the social fabric of Viking life. And just like the runic seals of regular traders, the chief's symbol carried significant weight in the Viking world. Imagine a large Viking longhouse filled with the sounds of crackling fire and the rhythmic thud of mead mugs on heavy wooden tables. At the head of the room sits the chief, an imposing figure who not only commands the respect of his people, but whose personal seal is respected across vast distances. The chief's seal was more than just a mark of authority. It was a symbol of the chief's very power. When the chief stamped his seal on an agreement, it was as if he were saying, "This deal is blessed by the highest authority." A mere trader or merchant could rely on a simple rune-etched piece of wood, but a Viking chief's seal carried immense significance, and it wasn't something you could easily dismiss. The Viking chief wasn't just a military leader. They were a political figure, a protector, and a judge. In a world without the modern institutions we take for granted, such as courts or a formal bureaucracy, the chief had to be a jack of all trades. Their seal was used to mark everything from trade agreements to oaths of loyalty to promises of protection. Imagine being a Viking warrior or a trader in need of protection for your ship while traveling down a treacherous river. What would you do? You'd seek the chief's protection, of course, and you'd do so by presenting your chief's seal. The Vikings lived in a world where personal bonds and promises were the foundations of their society. If you wanted to be part of a community, you needed to align yourself with a chief. They were the ones who ensured safety, facilitated trade, and maintained order. And while their seals didn't come with the polished efficiency of modern corporate logos, they were far more significant because without that seal, without that chief's blessing, you were essentially powerless. Historians still argue whether the chief's seals were more ceremonial or whether they held the same transactional weight as the personal seals of merchants. Some scholars believe that the chief's seal was a powerful symbol of divine right or approval, imbuing the document or agreement with a kind of sacred authority. Others suggest that the seals were simply administrative tools used to maintain order in an otherwise chaotic world. But regardless of the debate, what's clear is that the Viking chief's seal was the ultimate mark of authority and legitimacy. And in a world where survival could depend on the strength of your alliances, the seal of a respected chief was priceless. Imagine traveling from one village to the next with a document bearing the chief's seal. That seal would open doors, grant you favors, and protect you from harm. It was your ticket to legitimacy. For the Vikings, there was no higher social currency than a chief's seal. It was the ultimate business card, a stamp of power, authority, and perhaps most importantly, survival. But let's not forget the underlying truth here. The chief's seal wasn't just for show. It was a tool, a vital instrument of governance. It represented more than just an individual. It represented the will of an entire community. When you looked at the chief's seal, you saw a symbol that spoke for the entire tribe, for the collective will of those who followed him. The seal was a visual shorthand for an entire network of relationships and agreements. It was a promise made not just by the chief, but by the people who had sworn loyalty to him. In Viking society, promises were often all that stood between life and death. If you made a promise and didn't deliver, your reputation would be destroyed, and you might very well find yourself exiled, or worse. So, when a chief made a promise, it was binding. The seal was the tangible proof that the chief's word was solid, unbreakable. It wasn't something you could take lightly, and it was certainly not something that could be faked. Much like the modern world of business, the Viking world operated on a system of trust, and the chief's seal was the gold standard. At this point, you might be thinking about how little has changed since the days of the Vikings. While we may have moved beyond wooden tokens and rune-carved seals, the underlying principle of personal branding, networking, and building trust has remained exactly the same. In the modern world, we hand out business cards, logos, and promotional materials to establish credibility and make a strong first impression. But those symbols are just as potent as the Viking seals that opened doors and closed deals. Whether it's a logo on a business card or a carefully carved rune on a seal, these symbols are our modern-day seals of trust. The key difference: we no longer need to carve them into wood, but the idea remains the same. Now, imagine walking into a high-stakes meeting, perhaps with potential clients or partners. You exchange business cards, each one a carefully crafted piece of design meant to encapsulate your brand's identity. You might not have a Viking chief's seal to back you up, but that little piece of paper carries the same weight, the weight of your reputation, your promise, and your ability to deliver. When we look back at the Vikings, we see a society that was ahead of its time in understanding the importance of identity and trust in business. Their seals weren't just marks of personal identity. They were tools of survival. And maybe that's the biggest lesson we can learn from their methods. Our symbols, our seals, our business cards, and logos aren't just decoration. They carry weight, they carry meaning, and they have the power to open or close doors in ways we don't often realize. As we continue to peel back the layers of Viking social dynamics and business practices, let's take a moment to dive into one of the most significant trade hubs of the Viking world, Birka. If you were a Viking merchant, This bustling city on the island of Björkö, near modern-day Stockholm, was where you'd want to be. Björkö wasn't just a marketplace. It was a vibrant epicenter of commerce, culture, and, of course, social connections. Björkö's trade routes stretched far and wide, connecting Vikings with distant lands like the Byzantine Empire, the Slavic regions, and even the Islamic caliphates. As a Viking trader, you would have passed through the city's wooden gates with one primary goal in mind: to make a deal. But making that deal wasn't as simple as handing over goods and money. Just like today's business world, it was all about forging relationships, understanding the unspoken rules of trust, and presenting yourself with the right credentials. In Björkö, those credentials came in the form of your personal seal. Imagine yourself entering Björkö's bustling marketplace. The air is thick with the scent of fish, spices, and fur. Viking merchants, along with traders from far-off lands, set up their stalls under the protection of tall wooden walls. You hear a symphony of languages: Slavic, Arabic, Old Norse, mixed with the clink of coins and the sound of haggling. Amidst this frenzy, you know that your reputation precedes you. You don't need to shout your name across the marketplace. You have a simple piece of wood in your hand, carved with your personal seal. When you present it to someone, it speaks for you. This seal is more than just a piece of decoration. It's a guarantee of your trustworthiness, a sign that you come with a reputation built on honest dealings and reliable trade. Just as you would hand over your business card today, the Viking trader would hand over a piece of wood, metal, or bone, and the recipient would recognize it immediately. The reputation that accompanied the seal could make or break the deal. And if the seal belonged to someone of authority, say a respected chief, then the promise it represented could carry even more weight. Historians still argue whether Viking seals were strictly used for trade, or whether they also held deeper significance in the Viking legal system. Some scholars believe that seals played a role in formalizing agreements, marking contracts, and ensuring that oaths of loyalty were upheld. Others argue that the seals were more informal, used primarily for personal branding and establishing trust in a marketplace that was, at times, lawless. Either way, the presence of seals in Björkö's trade ecosystem speaks volumes about the importance of identity and trust in Viking society. As you wander through the market, your eyes catch sight of the goods being exchanged. Traders from all over Europe, Asia, and Africa are gathered here. Their wares on display: silks, spices, furs, weapons, and even slaves. But what really catches your attention is the way each transaction seems to unfold. Merchants don't just negotiate prices, they negotiate trust, reputation, and honor. A merchant who hands you their seal is offering a promise that they'll hold up their end of the deal, whether it's delivering goods or paying in gold. If they don't, their reputation is ruined, and their seal becomes a mark of dishonor. The same could happen to you, of course, but with the right seal, Your name could be respected far and wide. Now, you might be wondering how much of this business card exchange was formalized, and how much was just a product of Viking culture. After all, the Vikings didn't have the kind of legal systems and contracts we rely on today. So how did it all work? The answer lies in the Viking worldview. Their society was built on the concept of honor. Living up to your word was paramount. The seal was a symbol that your word was as valuable as gold. If you made a deal and broke it, it wasn't just a matter of losing money. It was a matter of losing your status, your relationships, and your future prospects in a world where trade could take place over vast distances. Relying on your reputation was everything. If you were a merchant traveling through Scandinavia and you met a Viking chief whose seal you recognized, you knew you could trust them. But if you encountered someone with an unfamiliar seal, it would be a moment of judgment. What kind of reputation did that seal represent? Was it the mark of a trustworthy merchant or someone known for their deceit? The Vikings didn't have the option of checking reviews online, and they didn't have the luxury of easily verifying a person's history. Instead, they relied on these symbols to convey all the information they needed about a person's character and reliability. And then there's the more mystical aspect of the Viking seal, because runes were not only a written language, but also carried symbolic and magical significance. The act of presenting a seal may have also had a spiritual element. Some believe that these runic symbols held power beyond their practical uses. To present a seal to another person wasn't just a gesture of trust. It might also have been a way of invoking protection or invoking the favor of the gods. The Vikings lived in a world where the boundaries between the sacred and the mundane were blurred, and their runic seals may have carried a divine weight to them. Think about it. When you hand over a business card today, it's a simple exchange of information. Your name, your role, and your contact details. But for the Vikings, their seal was more than just a business transaction. It was an extension of their very essence. Their seal was a reflection of their integrity, their reputation, and their connection to the divine. At the heart of Viking trade, Birka wasn't just a place for goods. It was a place for the exchange of promises, bonds, and trust. The seal, whether it was carved into wood, metal, or stone, was the physical manifestation of those promises. And just like today's business cards, it carried the weight of identity, reputation, and the possibility of future connections. Let's step back for a moment and focus on something even more intimate and powerful: the personal seals of Vikings. We've explored how these seals functioned as social tools in trade, networking, and even diplomacy. But there's another layer to these seals, something much more personal. Imagine yourself walking through a Viking village, watching as men and women carve their symbols into leather or metal. Each seal is unique, a reflection of the individual who owns it. These seals didn't just represent merchants or chiefs. they also signified personal identity, family, legacy, and social standing. As we look at these personal seals, it becomes clear that they weren't just functional. They were also deeply symbolic, just like today, where people design logos or brands to represent themselves. The Vikings carved runes and symbols that communicated something fundamental about who they were. Maybe your seal would have a symbol of Thor's hammer, signifying strength and protection. Or perhaps you'd choose an animal, like a raven or wolf symbols that conveyed your connection to the wild world around you. Each rune and symbol was a carefully chosen piece of personal branding, one that reflected the owner's values, connections, and ambitions. Historians still debate whether these personal seals were purely functional or if they also served as spiritual markers. In Viking society, runes were often associated with divine and magical powers, and it's likely that the runes carved on these seals were more than just letters. They may have been seen as protective charms or a way of invoking the gods. For example, many Viking runic inscriptions found on personal items are not simply names. They are composed of combinations of runes believed to hold magical significance. And while we might not fully understand the mystical aspect of these seals today, it's clear that the Vikings saw them as more than mere tools. They were deeply tied to the spiritual and supernatural world. When you carried your personal seal, it wasn't just an identification tag or a means of conducting business. It was a reminder of who you were in the grand tapestry of Viking society. It told everyone around you your name, your clan, your identity, and perhaps most importantly, the kind of person you were striving to be. Just like a modern entrepreneur's logo, your personal seal was your calling card. It was a symbol of your brand, your worth, and the reputation you were building in a society where reputation was everything. In the Viking world, the idea of personal reputation was tied to your family's honor, just as you might feel the weight of your family name today. Vikings carried the legacy of their ancestors with them every time they presented their seal. If you were a respected warrior or an esteemed merchant, your seal became a mark of respect for your whole family. The legacy of your ancestors was woven into that symbol, and it was as much a reflection of your bloodline as it was a reflection of your individual actions. Imagine you're in a Viking village, standing near the fire at night, when someone hands you a piece of wood with their seal. You don't need to know this person's entire history. The seal tells you everything you need to know. It's a promise, an unspoken bond that they come from a family of warriors or traders, and that they uphold the values that their ancestors instilled in them. In many ways, that seal represents the continuity of Viking culture, a culture built on honor, legacy, and the trust passed down through generations. Let's talk about how these personal seals might have played a role in Viking social gatherings and feasts. Picture yourself sitting at a long table, enjoying a feast with your fellow villagers. As the food is passed around and mead fills the air with its warmth, you begin to trade stories and discuss upcoming plans. A fellow Viking trader might hand you a small carved seal, a symbol of their family, their reputation, and their trade. By giving you this seal, they're not just offering a physical object, they're offering their trust, their bond, and their promise. And if you're holding that seal, it's not just a trinket, it's a responsibility. You know that the trust they've placed in you is not just about the immediate transaction, it's about maintaining that bond, upholding the honor of your families, and ensuring that future dealings will reflect this integrity. In Viking society, a man or woman's word was their bond. And while we've moved away from relying solely on personal seals, in modern business dealings, the underlying principle remains the same. Reputation, integrity, and trust are still the foundations upon which everything else is built. Whether you're handing over a business card today or offering a rune-inscribed seal in the Viking world, you're making a promise that you'll follow through, that you'll honor the bond, and that your name will be worth something. But what about those seals with more mystical properties? For the Vikings, runes weren't just practical tools. They were symbols of power. Many of the runes had mystical connotations. The Norse believed that runes had magical abilities, that they could protect you from harm, bring you luck, or even help you curse your enemies. If you were a Viking warrior, you might carry a seal with runes carved into it, not just as an identifier, but as a shield against the forces that would seek to harm you. These seals were as much about the supernatural world as they were about the physical one, and that made them incredibly powerful. In fact, some Viking leaders would use these mystical symbols to enhance their personal power and authority. They might wear seals with powerful runic combinations, or use them in formal rituals to invoke the protection of the gods. It's not hard to imagine that these symbols would carry even more weight when given to someone in a business deal or social interaction. A seal wasn't just a mark of identity. It was an amulet, a piece of protective magic woven into the fabric of Viking society. And much like today's logos or signatures, the Viking seals had the ability to invoke respect, fear, and awe. When you presented your seal, you were not just showing who you were. You were showing that you were part of something larger, something that had the power to influence the world around you. In this way, the personal seal was as much about social capital as it was about personal identity. It was an ancient form of branding, woven into the very fabric of Viking life. By now, you might be wondering just how far-reaching the Viking influence of personal seals extended. While we've focused primarily on trade and social life, it's essential to understand the profound impact these seals had on Viking diplomacy. Unlike what many of us might imagine, the Vikings were not just brutal warriors, they were also shrewd diplomats, and their personal seals played an integral part in how they navigated relationships with other cultures. Imagine yourself standing before a Viking king, one of the powerful Norse leaders who ruled over vast territories. You're negotiating a trade agreement, and the air is thick with tension as both sides attempt to secure the best deal. The Viking king, whose seal you recognize, makes a gesture with a calm and deliberate motion. He presses his seal into a soft piece of wax or clay. The impression left behind is unmistakable, a mark of authenticity, of intent, and of power. In that moment, you know that any agreement sealed with his mark is not just an ordinary deal. It's a formalized commitment, binding not just on the individuals involved, but on entire communities. Viking diplomacy was often conducted through personal interactions and the use of symbolic gestures, such as these seals, to establish trust and legitimacy. But this practice wasn't limited to the Vikings themselves. Their reputation as fierce warriors and clever traders extended far beyond Scandinavia, and they often engaged in formal alliances and negotiations with kingdoms as far-reaching as the Byzantine Empire, the Franks, and even the Islamic Caliphate. And through these dealings, the Viking seal became an integral part of diplomatic processes. Historians still argue whether Viking diplomatic efforts were driven more by conquest or genuine statecraft. But what we know for sure is that the Vikings knew how to play the game of politics. The exchange of personal seals was often part of a larger diplomatic strategy. When Viking leaders exchanged seals with foreign rulers, it was more than just a courtesy. It was a pact, a way of saying, we are equals in this venture, and this seal will ensure that we hold up our side of the bargain. These seals transcended personal relationships. They were the keys to political legitimacy. Take, for example, the Viking settlement of the Danelaw in England. The Vikings had conquered large swaths of land, but it was through a series of diplomatic agreements and exchanges of seals that they were able to secure their place within the Anglo-Saxon political landscape. Viking kings like Ivar the Boneless or Guthrum signed treaties with the Anglo-Saxon kings, and these agreements weren't just about land. They were about mutual recognition. The Viking seals acted as both a symbol of authority and a guarantee that the signatories were serious about upholding the treaty terms. Now, it's easy to think of Viking diplomacy as just a precursor to modern treaties, but there's something more poetic and almost romantic about it. The seal wasn't just a symbol of formal politics. It was a personal bond, an oath of honor. When Viking kings exchanged their seals with other rulers, they weren't simply marking the start of a business deal. They were forging a relationship built on mutual respect, honor, and trust. This brings us back to one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking seals: their ability to speak volumes without saying a word. A seal was more than just a piece of identification. It was a message. When you handed over a seal, you weren't just making a trade or signing an agreement. You were offering a promise, an unspoken word of honor that would bind you to the agreement in ways that modern signatures or contracts simply can't replicate. Imagine holding that kind of responsibility in your hands, knowing that the weight of 1,000 years of history was tied to that simple mark. It's also worth considering how the Viking leaders used their seals in public life, much like today's business leaders or high-profile politicians. A Viking king's seal was an emblem of power. The seal wasn't just a mark of legitimacy. It was also a tool for control. When a king pressed his seal into a document, that document was imbued with authority. It could be used to levy taxes, confirm alliances, or authorize military action. It was a tool of governance, no less important than a crown or a sword. In many ways, the Viking kings used their seals to establish and maintain their power. A king who controlled the seals could control the flow of information, the direction of trade, and even the alliances that kept his kingdom secure. In this way, the seals weren't just symbols of personal identity. They were expressions of statecraft, the tools of rulers who understood the importance of symbolism in maintaining authority. And yet, in the hands of a humble merchant, the seal carried the same weight of importance, even if the stakes weren't quite as high. For the Vikings, the seal was not just an item for the elite. It was a cultural institution, one that permeated all levels of society, from the most powerful kings to the lowliest traders. The seal was a mark of identity, integrity, and connection. The use of seals as symbols of power and trust might seem like a distant echo in our modern world, but the principles remain remarkably relevant. Just like a business leader today, the Viking king understood that their seal was not just a tool. It was an extension of their power and influence. Whether you're a corporate executive or a Viking warlord, the message is the same. Reputation and trust are your greatest assets. At the heart of Viking society, the seal was the ultimate tool for creating lasting relationships, making deals, and ensuring that promises were kept. It wasn't just about trading goods or securing land. It was about the very bonds that held society together. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, trust and reputation were more valuable than any treasure, and the seal was the key to ensuring both. Let's continue with another fascinating aspect of Viking society, the role that symbols and seals played not just in business and diplomacy, but in the personal and spiritual lives of the Vikings. We've explored how seals were tools of trade, trust, and authority, but they were also tied deeply to the mystical and divine. The Vikings were a people who believed in magic, in runes, and in the divine will of the gods, and this belief permeated their everyday life, even in how they conducted business and interacted with one another. Imagine yourself standing by a Viking fire at night, surrounded by the hum of voices and the crackle of the flames. The air is filled with the smell of roasting meat and the soft clinking of weapons and tools. A Viking chief, perhaps a high-ranking warrior or a spiritual leader, is preparing to exchange an agreement with another leader. As part of this exchange, he presents a seal carved with intricate runes, symbols not only of his identity, but of his connection to the divine. In this moment, the seal becomes more than just a piece of wood or stone. It becomes a powerful tool infused with both personal and spiritual meaning. The Vikings believed that the runes had magical properties. Each rune was more than just a letter in an alphabet. It was a symbol imbued with the power of the gods. Some runes were thought to bring luck, others to protect against harm, and still others to curse an enemy or ensure victory in battle. When a Viking presented a seal, it was not just a sign of who they were. It was a symbol that could invoke the favor of the gods themselves. Imagine the weight of that. The person receiving the seal knew that they weren't simply receiving a mark of identity. They were receiving a token that could shape their fate. Historians still debate the true extent to which Vikings saw their seals as magical. Some scholars argue that the runes were seen purely as a written form of communication and identity, while others believe that they were regarded as channels to the divine. But what's clear is that these symbols were never neutral. They carried power, and that power was woven into the fabric of Viking society. When you handed over a seal, you weren't just making a promise. You were invoking a deeper layer of trust and influence. To the Viking mind, a personal seal wasn't just about showing who you were. It was about showing who you were connected to. Whether you were a merchant, a warrior, or a king, your seal carried with it a link to something greater than yourself. It connected you to your ancestors, your gods, and your people. And just as today's business logos often convey a company's values or ethos, the Viking seal carried a message about the owner's character, lineage, and spiritual alignment. This mystical dimension of the seal wasn't limited to trade or diplomacy. It was woven into the very fabric of Viking daily life. Consider the concept of sealing an oath. When Vikings swore oaths to one another, they often did so by presenting their seals. These seals weren't just ceremonial, they were considered binding. A Viking's word was their bond, and by sealing an agreement with a personal mark, they were invoking the power of the gods to ensure that the promise would be kept. If the oath was broken, it wasn't just the individual who would face consequences. It was their entire community, their gods, and their ancestors. The weight of breaking such a promise was immense. In Viking law, the act of sealing an agreement with a personal mark carried immense responsibility. The law itself was intertwined with spiritual beliefs. Vikings believed that violating an oath could bring divine punishment. So when you handed over your seal, you weren't just sealing a deal in the practical sense. You were invoking the power of the sacred. This practice may seem strange or archaic to us today, but it underscores how deeply the Vikings embedded their spiritual beliefs into every aspect of their lives, including their business dealings. This spiritual aspect of Viking seals also highlights something profound. The Vikings understood that trust wasn't just a social contract. It was a spiritual one, just like today, when we enter into business relationships or make promises. We often rely on the idea that the other person will act in good faith. But for the Vikings, this wasn't just a social expectation. It was a divine one. They believed that breaking a promise wasn't just breaking the rules of society. It was defying the gods themselves. Imagine the power this belief held. If you were a Viking merchant, your seal wasn't just a stamp of your personal identity. It was a powerful tool that linked you to a divine realm, ensuring that the trust you placed in your transactions was more than just a social nicety. It was a sacred bond, and in a world where betrayal was often punished by violence, the promise, sealed with a mark, carried with it an immense weight of responsibility. Let's shift gears for a moment and think about how this belief system influenced the Vikings' dealings with other cultures. When they traveled far from home, across the seas, to distant lands, they didn't just take their goods with them. They took their beliefs. A Viking arriving in Constantinople, for example, wouldn't just present his goods. He would present his seal, imbued with the magic and power of his people. And when the recipient saw that seal, they wouldn't just recognize it as a mark of identity. They would recognize it as a token that connected the Viking to a greater power, something that transcended the material world. This is where the mysticism of the Viking seal became an important cultural currency. It made the Vikings seem not just like traders, but like emissaries of the divine. Historians still argue whether Vikings' seals were more magical or practical, but the truth likely lies somewhere in between. The seals were not just tools for business. They were instruments of power, trust, and divine authority. When you handed over your seal, you were not only sharing a part of your identity, you were offering a piece of your very soul, a link to the gods, and an oath that would be honored not just by you, but by the entire universe. In this way, Viking seals weren't merely business tools. They were an ancient form of branding, yes, but they were also magical tokens, capable of ensuring the trust of others, protecting the bearer, and invoking divine favor. The seals weren't just part of the mundane world. They were part of the spiritual and supernatural realm, linking the Vikings to the gods and the fates that shaped their world. As we continue to explore the rich tapestry of Viking culture and the role of seals in their world, let's take a moment to consider how these ancient practices influenced the Viking approach to both trade and identity. While we've focused heavily on the social, diplomatic, and spiritual significance of seals, there's another vital layer we must uncover: the Vikings' deep connection to their environment, and how that connection influenced the design and usage of their personal seals. Imagine yourself once again in the Viking world. You've just received a seal from a fellow Viking, and as you hold it, you notice the intricate details. Perhaps a wolf's head carved deeply into the surface, or a symbol of Thor's hammer hammering away in sharp relief, you begin to realize that these seals weren't just symbols of power or personal identity. They were reflections of the natural world and the animals, gods, and forces that shaped the Vikings' lives. Vikings didn't live in an abstract world of ideals. They were deeply connected to the land, to nature, and to the animals that roamed their lands. In fact, much of their identity, their myths, and their culture were intertwined with nature. The wolves, the ravens, the bears, these animals held deep symbolic meaning for the Vikings. And when it came time to carve their personal seals, many Viking traders, warriors, and leaders chose symbols that reflected their intimate connection to the world around them. This isn't just poetic imagery. It's a direct reflection of how the Vikings saw themselves in relation to nature. They didn't view animals or the natural world as something separate from themselves. They saw these forces as intimately connected to their own identity. This is why the Vikings' personal seal was often an animal or a symbol that represented not just strength, but also a deep spiritual connection. A raven's head carved into a seal wasn't just a decoration. It was a reminder of the god Odin, the all-knowing, who was often depicted with ravens at his side. Likewise, a seal with the image of a wolf may have symbolized strength, courage, and the unyielding will to survive. Historians still debate the exact meaning behind the choice of symbols in Viking seals. Some scholars suggest that these seals were a kind of personal totem, an animal or figure that represented the Vikings' personal characteristics or aspirations. Others believe that the symbols were a more religious or spiritual expression, linking the person directly to the gods they worshipped. In either case, what's clear is that the Viking seal wasn't just an impersonal mark. It was a direct reflection of the person who carried it and the forces that shaped their worldview. Now, let's think about the Viking trader. Once again, picture yourself journeying to distant lands, traveling through snowy forests and icy seas, all the while carrying your seal with you as you encounter new cultures and forge new relationships. Your seal acts as both a tool of identification and a reflection of your nature. It's a symbol of who you are, where you come from, and what you stand for. Perhaps you're dealing with a trader from the far-off Byzantine Empire who is unfamiliar with the intricacies of Viking symbolism. In this case, the seal becomes a key to understanding not just your name, but your culture and your identity. Viking traders often traveled long distances from the icy north to the warm shores of the Mediterranean. They encountered people from many different cultures, and the personal seal became a tool to break down cultural barriers. The symbols carved into the seal weren't just a local currency. They were a universal language, a way for the Vikings to communicate who they were and what they represented, even in the midst of unfamiliar lands. In this way, the Viking seal became an essential part of cross-cultural communication. You could walk into a market in the Middle East or in the Byzantine Empire, and if you knew the symbolism of the seals, you'd understand something vital about the person before they even spoke. Perhaps a seal with a horse on it would indicate that the Viking was a trader from the steppes of Eurasia. Maybe a seal depicting a dragon symbolized a warrior with fierce ambitions. Regardless of the culture or the place, the seal was a shorthand for identity that transcended language barriers. And this idea of seals transcending language barriers ties directly into the mystical significance of runes. The Vikings believed that runes were not only a form of communication, but also a method of invoking power. When you engraved a rune, you weren't just writing. It was an act of connecting with the divine. So when a Viking trader pressed his seal into a document or handed it over to another, it wasn't just a transaction. It was an invocation. It was as if the seal was carrying the weight of the entire cosmos with it, invoking the gods, the ancestors, and the very forces of nature themselves. This deeply spiritual view of seals made them even more potent. The personal seal wasn't just a representation of a person's name or status. It was a sacred object, an object that connected the wearer with forces far beyond the mortal realm. To break the promise that a seal represented wasn't just a dishonorable act. It was a violation of something sia. This is what made the Viking seal so powerful, both in trade and in social life. It carried with it the weight of personal honor, the trust of the community, and for many Vikings, the will of the gods. This mystical connection between the Viking and their seal also influenced their everyday interactions. It wasn't uncommon for a Viking to carry their seal with them wherever they went, whether they were attending a feast, making a trade, or meeting with a fellow Viking. Their seal was always on hand, ready to offer proof of their identity and their trustworthiness. It became as intrinsic to their identity as their name, their family, or their reputation. Historians still argue about the practical uses of seals, but one thing is certain: the seal was a crucial part of Viking life. It represented far more than just a means of identification. It represented the intersection of identity, honor, nature, and spirituality. It was both a business tool and a deeply sacred object, infused with divine power and ancestral legacy. In many ways, the seal was a reflection of the Vikings themselves, complex, powerful, and deeply connected to the world around them. Whether it was carved from wood, bone, or metal, the seal told a story. Your story. And just like today's business cards or logos, it was a symbol that carried weight, power, and meaning. As we delve deeper into the world of Viking seals and symbols, we begin to see how these personal markers not only influenced trade, diplomacy, and identity, but also shaped the very way the Vikings interacted with their world. In this section, we'll turn our attention to the practicalities of how seals were used in Viking society, with a special focus on their role in securing trade agreements, marking ownership, and providing a form of personal guarantee that was integral to the survival and success of Vikings as merchants and leaders. Picture yourself once again walking into a bustling Viking market, perhaps in a port city like Hedeby, one of the largest and most important trading centers of the Viking world. The air is thick with the smells of salt water, fish, and freshly baked bread. Merchants from distant lands have gathered here, from the British Isles to the far reaches of the East. You can hear the hum of conversation in a dozen different languages, but the exchange isn't only in words. It's in the gestures, the seals, and the tokens of trust that pass from one hand to another. In this environment, your personal seal is your passport to trade and negotiation. A merchant who approaches you with a deal might not speak your language, but when they hand you a token marked with their personal seal, it's as if they're speaking a universal language. The design of their seal may communicate something about their trade or reputation, or it may be a family crest passed down through generations that signifies both their lineage and their honor. Historians still argue whether Viking trade was predominantly based on direct bartering, or if there was a more formal currency system at play. Some evidence suggests that the Vikings were among the first to use silver coins in their trade with the Islamic world, and these coins were often stamped with powerful symbols, similar to how Viking seals were used in their own society. But regardless of the medium of exchange, the use of personal seals as a form of business guarantee was an essential aspect of Viking commerce. The practical purpose of these seals was clear. They were used to authenticate agreements, mark ownership, and confirm that the items being traded were legitimate. If a Viking merchant was trading furs, for example, the seal they placed on the transaction could ensure that the goods were genuine, that the trade was sanctioned, and that the person carrying the goods could be trusted to complete the deal. If you were a Viking leader or warrior, your seal could serve as a personal guarantee that any promises made in your name would be upheld. Imagine you're a Viking who has just struck a deal with a merchant from far-off lands. The agreement is struck, and to solidify the deal, the merchant hands you a seal. This is no mere formality. It's a bond, a symbol of their word. The seal functions like a modern-day signature, but it also carries the weight of an oath, a spiritual promise that the transaction will be honored. If the merchant reneges on the deal, the reputation of their seal will suffer, and they will be branded as untrustworthy, their name tainted in the community. If the deal goes through as promised, the seal serves as proof that trust was placed and that the community's word was good. Now, think about how this system of personal seals functions as a kind of early contract. In the absence of written contracts or signed agreements, a Viking's seal functioned as a binding agreement, one that could be presented and verified by anyone involved in the transaction. When a chief or leader pressed their seal onto a document, it wasn't just an official endorsement. It was a binding promise that whatever was written or agreed upon would be upheld. There was no middleman to verify the deal, only the personal responsibility of the individual whose seal was being presented. This highlights a crucial aspect of Viking society, the importance of personal responsibility. Unlike today's business world, where legal systems and bureaucracy help to ensure that deals are followed through. The Vikings were a people who relied heavily on their personal word and the honor embedded in their seals. In Viking times, your seal was the ultimate form of guarantee, and it reflected the trust placed in you by your community and your peers. But Viking seals weren't just used for trade deals and diplomacy. They were also a key tool in establishing ownership. Just as today's business leaders might stamp official documents with their signature, Viking merchants and traders would mark ownership of their goods with their personal seal. This wasn't just about marking a product for sale. It was about confirming that the goods were legally owned and could be traced back to the person responsible. If there was any dispute over ownership or authenticity, the presence of a seal made it clear who had the right to the goods. It was a direct form of property verification, ensuring that those involved in a trade knew exactly who owned what. In Viking settlements, it wasn't uncommon to see seals used in a similar way. If you owned a piece of land or a specific product, you would mark it with your seal. This marked ownership in a way that transcended simple property claims. It was a mark of legitimacy. If someone disputed your ownership, the seal could be presented as proof that the land, livestock, or other property was yours to claim. Much like a modern-day deed or title, Viking seals could be used to establish legal claims over property and goods. Historians still debate the extent to which Viking seals were used in formalized legal systems. Some argue that the Viking approach to law was informal, based more on oral traditions and local customs than on formal written documents. Others believe that the seals played a more official role in maintaining order and resolving disputes. What is clear, however, is that Viking seals were integral to maintaining social and economic order. They were part of a system where the individual's word, reinforced by a personal seal, was as valuable as any written document. In Viking society, where honor and reputation were paramount, the seal became a symbol of personal integrity, trust, and authority. Whether you were sealing a business deal, confirming ownership, or marking an agreement with a foreign trader, your seal was a direct representation of your character. In this way, Viking seals weren't just tools. They were keys to ensuring that agreements were honored, goods were properly traded, and disputes were resolved. They were the cornerstone of Viking social and economic interactions. As we continue to unravel the many layers of Viking life and their use of personal seals, we now shift our focus to a subject often overlooked but equally important: the way Viking seals and symbols influenced their relationships with the gods and the supernatural. For the Vikings, belief in the divine wasn't something confined to the realm of religion. It was woven into every aspect of life, including trade, social exchanges, and even the use of personal seals. Imagine a Viking standing in front of a sacred site, a grove of trees where the gods are believed to dwell. In their hands, they hold their seal, carefully carved with runes that represent their name, their family, and perhaps even their god. Before making a trade or entering into an agreement, it was common for Vikings to ask for the blessings of the gods, invoking their favor through symbols like these. The seal then became not only a tool for personal identity and business, but also a conduit for divine protection and guidance. Vikings understood their place within the vast, interconnected cosmos. They saw their lives as a delicate balance between the forces of nature, the gods, and human action. To them, everything was governed by a complex system of cosmic laws, and their actions, especially those involving trust, loyalty, and promises, were never truly separate from the divine realm. This belief imbued the use of seals with a sense of sacredness, making them more than mere symbols or signatures. They were ways of bringing the gods into the everyday world. Historians still argue whether Vikings truly believed that their seals had magical powers, but one thing is certain: they believed that their symbols carried divine significance. Runes, the written form that often appeared on Viking seals, were thought to be a sacred gift from the gods themselves, imparted to humankind by the god Odin, who sacrificed himself to gain knowledge of these powerful symbols. When a Viking carved a rune or used a seal, it was more than a simple act. It was seen as a way to connect with the divine, to harness the supernatural forces that governed life and death, war and peace. For instance, consider the significance of the Thor's hammer symbol. This was not just a decorative motif, nor was it only a symbol of strength. It was also a spiritual one. Thor, the god of thunder, was seen as the protector of mankind, the one who ensured the safety of the people from the forces of chaos. Carving this symbol into a seal could invoke Thor's protection in matters of trade, politics, or warfare. It wasn't just about identity. It was about ensuring that the gods were on your side. Likewise, the Valknut, a symbol associated with Odin, and the transition to the afterlife, was often found on Viking seals. It's believed that the Valknut represented the link between life and death, the human world and the divine. In some ways, the Valknut on a Viking seal could have been a mark of divine favor, ensuring that the Vikings' actions were in alignment with cosmic law. To possess such a symbol on your seal was to carry a powerful connection to Odin, the god who ruled over wisdom, war, and the afterlife. We might think of modern-day rituals like signing a contract or taking an oath as secular acts, but for the Vikings, the very act of carving a rune or pressing a seal into a piece of wax or wood was a way to bind oneself to the divine. It was a promise not just to another person, but to the gods themselves. If you broke that promise, the consequences were not just social or financial. They were spiritual, and that could lead to divine retribution. This divine aspect of Viking seals made them incredibly powerful, just like today's corporate seals, which symbolize authority and trust. Viking seals were imbued with a unique form of power, one that tied the owner not just to their own community, but to the gods themselves. The seal wasn't simply a tool for practical matters. It was a symbol of your relationship to the divine order of things. This connection to the divine was particularly important when it came to legal matters. Viking society was not governed by a formal, written system of laws as we know them today. Instead, laws were often oral traditions passed down through generations, reinforced by customs and rituals. In this context, Viking seals became a key mechanism for ensuring that agreements were kept, not just on a social or legal level, but on a spiritual one. To break a promise sealed with a divine symbol wasn't just to break the law, it was to risk invoking the wrath of the gods. Let's consider a practical example of how this might work. Imagine that a Viking warrior and a trader are negotiating a deal. The warrior is well known for his courage and strength, and his personal seal is a powerful symbol of those qualities. But the trader, who might come from a distant land, isn't sure whether he can trust the warrior's word. The warrior offers his seal as a guarantee. As he presses his mark into the wax, he's not only offering a personal guarantee of trust, but also invoking divine protection. The trader, understanding the power of the seal and the spiritual weight it carries, knows that this deal is backed not just by human honor, but by the gods themselves. The seal, then, is both a legal and spiritual bond, one that transcends simple contract law. We can also look at the role of skalds, the Viking poets, who often used the power of words and symbols to shape history. Skalds would compose poems or sagas that immortalized a person's deeds or promises. If you were a Viking leader and wanted to ensure that your seal was respected and remembered, a skald could immortalize it in verse. By doing so, the leader's seal became not only a personal guarantee, but also a part of the divine narrative of Viking history. This melding of art, poetry, and divine symbolism shows just how intertwined the Viking seal was with every aspect of their society, from trade and diplomacy to law and religion. Historians still debate the precise role of the skalds in Viking diplomacy and law, but it's clear that their influence was significant. A seal, after all, could be forgotten or lost over time, but a saga written by a skald would carry a person's deeds and promises into the future. The skalds, in their role as spiritual and cultural historians, helped preserve the divine nature of Viking seals, ensuring that the spiritual and personal power they wielded would be remembered for generations. The seals, therefore, were not merely tools for everyday transactions. They were symbols of the interconnectedness between humans and gods. They represented not just identity or ownership, but a pact with the divine forces that governed Viking existence. Each rune carved, each symbol pressed into wax, was an act of communication with the gods, a way of ensuring that one's promises were not only kept in this world, but honored in the next. As we approach the final stages of our exploration into the world of Viking seals, it's time to consider how these seals might have influenced the Vikings' understanding of legacy and reputation, and how they shaped the way future generations would view their ancestors. In many ways, the Viking seal is a direct link to the past, a tool that preserved not just the individual's identity, but also the cultural and spiritual values that guided Viking society. Imagine a Viking warrior having just returned from a long voyage, standing on the shores of his homeland. He carries with him not only treasure and goods, but also the heavy responsibility of ensuring that his actions, his deeds, are remembered. He takes a moment to carve his personal seal into a piece of wood or stone, pressing the sharp edges of his blade into the surface, leaving behind a mark that signifies not just his identity, but his connection to his ancestors and the gods. That mark, that seal, will live on. Even after the warrior has passed, it is his legacy. This act of leaving behind a seal, whether it was inscribed on a piece of wood, metal, or even wax, was an important part of how Vikings understood legacy. Your seal wasn't just something you used for trade or political agreements. It was something that ensured your memory would endure, much like the way modern people preserve their legacy through the digital world. The Vikings preserved their name, their reputation, and their honor through their seals. A warrior who left behind a seal wasn't just ensuring a good trade deal. They were ensuring that their mark on the world would not be forgotten. Historians still argue whether the Viking seal was intended solely for practical purposes, or if it was more of a spiritual and cultural statement. But what is clear is that the seal played a key role in how Vikings understood their place in history. The Vikings had a deep sense of pride in their lineage, and they viewed their actions as part of a larger, ongoing narrative. By carving their seals into objects, whether they were trade goods, weapons, or legal documents, they were ensuring that their actions would be remembered long after their death. Let's think about the concept of Viking sagas, the epic tales that immortalized the heroes, kings, and warriors of Viking history. These sagas weren't just stories. They were part of a larger cultural effort to preserve the identity of the Vikings for posterity. A saga could immortalize a warrior's name, their deeds, and, crucially, the seals they used. The saga would be passed down from generation to generation, ensuring that the hero's name, along with the symbolic seal they used, would live on in the collective memory of Viking society. In some ways, the saga served as the perfect complement to the Viking seal. The seal marked a promise, a personal commitment that was upheld in the physical world, but the saga marked the legacy, ensuring that the actions of the individual would be remembered and celebrated in the spiritual and cultural realm, much like the modern idea of a brand that lives on after a company or person has passed. The Viking seal was a brand that linked the individual to a broader cultural story. Now, imagine a Viking village, generations after the warrior has passed, his descendants, carrying the weight of his legacy, still use his seal when conducting their own business and trading. The seal, with its carved runes, has passed through time, linking the living to the dead, the present to the past. For the Vikings, this wasn't just a symbolic act. It was a cultural imperative. To honor your ancestors was to ensure that their deeds would live on, and the seal was one of the most powerful ways to do that. When you used your seal, you weren't just asserting your own identity. You were asserting your place in a long line of warriors, traders, and leaders, all of whom had used the same symbols to leave their mark on the world. This focus on legacy and reputation also tied into the Vikings' beliefs in honor and the supernatural. The gods, after all, were the ultimate arbiters of legacy. If you lived your life with honor, upheld your promises, and maintained the trust of those around you, then your legacy would be ensured by the gods. If you were dishonorable, however, your name and your seal would fade from history, lost to the winds of time. The seal was both a personal and spiritual marker, linking you to both the gods and your community, ensuring that your actions were immortalized in both the human and divine realms. When we consider the Viking seal as part of a broader cultural system, it becomes clear that it was than just a physical object. It was a part of the cultural machinery that ensured the continuity of Viking identity, values, and traditions. The seal was a tool for shaping reputation and legacy, one that was connected not only to the living, but also to the past and the divine. Through the seal, the Vikings ensured that their actions, their honor, and their name would be remembered long after their physical body had returned to the earth. It's easy to see how the use of the seal can be compared to modern forms of legacy-building brands, logos, and even personal reputations built in the digital world. But in the Viking context, the seal was not just a symbol of personal achievement or success. It was a conduit for connecting the individual to something much larger, something cosmic. It was a way of ensuring that the individual's actions were part of a larger narrative, one that transcended their lifetime and connected them to their ancestors, their gods, and their community. By the time the Viking Age came to a close, the use of personal seals had become so ingrained in Viking culture that it was an essential part of both social and spiritual life. And even though the Viking world has long since faded into the pages of history, their legacy lives on, carried forward through the symbols they used to mark their place in the world. The Viking seal, with its runes and imagery, may no longer be in use today, but the idea of a symbol representing a person's identity, reputation, and legacy remains with us. As we approach the penultimate chapter of our journey through the Viking world of seals and symbols, it's time to reflect on how the use of personal seals shaped the modern world, particularly in the realm of business, law, and identity. While the Vikings may have used seals in a very different context, the underlying principles behind their use still resonate deeply in our world today. From the ancient runes pressed into wax to the sleek business logos of the modern day, the Viking seal laid the groundwork for much of the way we think about branding, trust, and personal identity. Take a moment to consider the simple yet powerful act of handing over a business card. You might see it as a mundane exchange, a way to provide contact information or introduce yourself. But much like the Viking trader offering a seal to guarantee their trustworthiness, handing over a business card today is still a deeply symbolic act. It's an introduction to who you are, what you stand for, and how you want to be remembered. It carries weight and meaning, just as the Viking seal did centuries ago. In Viking society, the seal was more than just a tool for trade. It was a way of asserting one's identity and guaranteeing one's actions. The seal functioned as a promise, not just between individuals, but also between the living and the divine. When a Viking handed over their seal, they weren't just presenting a mark. They were presenting a part of themselves, their honor, and their reputation. This profound connection between identity and action laid the foundation for how we think about trust today. Whether we're discussing business deals, legal contracts, or personal promises, the same principles of reputation and accountability that governed Viking seals still guide us today. The influence of Viking seals can also be seen in how modern businesses and corporations use logos and trademarks. Consider a company like Nike with its iconic swoosh. Just as the Vikings used their seals to establish credibility and trust, today's businesses rely on logos and trademarks to create brand identity and ensure their reputation in the marketplace. Like the Vikings' seals, these logos carry the weight of promises, made promises about the quality, reliability, and values that a company upholds, just as a Viking's seal spoke for them. Long after they were gone, a brand's logo serves as a legacy of trust and recognition. Of course, it's not just businesses that rely on symbols to communicate identity. In the modern world, we use symbols to define our personal identities as well. Think about the social media profiles we craft for ourselves. How we carefully choose profile pictures, bio descriptions, and hashtags to convey who we are and what we stand for. In many ways, this digital self-branding mirrors the Viking use of seals. Just as the Vikings used their personal seals to project an image of strength, honor, and integrity, we use our social media profiles to craft an image of ourselves that we want the world to see. The importance of personal identity in the Viking world, especially as it related to their seals, also offers valuable lessons in modern-day leadership and influence. Viking leaders didn't just wield physical power. They wielded the power of their reputation. The chief's seal, for example, was a symbol of authority and trust. In modern leadership, the same principles apply. Leaders must build trust and integrity to inspire others and ensure their success. Whether it's a CEO making a decision or a politician running for office, the symbol of their integrity, the seal of their leadership, can make or break their ability to lead effectively. Historically, Viking leaders used their seals to bind their promises and commands to the very fabric of their identity. Today, modern leaders rely on their own seals in the form of public trust and credibility. A political leader's word may be more influential than any contract they sign, just as a Viking leader's seal held the weight of their community's expectations and divine sanction. This symbolic legacy of power through reputation can be traced directly from the Vikings to the modern day. Let's also think about the role of Viking seals in legal matters. While the Vikings didn't have a formal system of written contracts like we do today, they relied on their seals to ensure that promises were kept. This trust-based system of agreements speaks to a fundamental principle that still exists in legal systems around the world today. The idea that a promise once made is binding. In modern legal contracts, the signature on a document functions much like the Viking seal. It serves as a guarantee that the person signing is committed to the terms of the agreement and is willing to be held accountable for their actions. The modern legal system, with its reliance on signed contracts and official documents, owes much to the Viking practice of using seals to ensure that agreements were honored. The concept of a personal guarantee, the idea that one's word and reputation are foundational to any transaction, is just as relevant today as it was during the Viking Age. But beyond the formal world of business and law, Viking seals also had a profound impact on the way we view personal reputation and trust in everyday life. In Viking society, a person's reputation could make or break them. If you were known for dishonesty or betrayal, your seal, your very identity would be tarnished. In the same way, our personal reputations today are built on trust, honesty, and integrity. A person's seal in modern society might not be physically pressed into wax or wood, but it's just as significant in shaping how others perceive us. Imagine walking into a job interview. For example, the resume or references you present act as your modern-day seal. They communicate to the employer who you are, what you've accomplished, and whether you can be trusted to uphold your promises. The same principles that guided Viking society's use of seals are alive and well today. Our personal seals are what determine whether we succeed or fail in our careers, relationships, and even our everyday interactions. As we step back and reflect on the Viking seals, it's clear that their influence stretches far beyond their immediate historical context. Whether it's the influence of seals on modern business practices, legal contracts, or personal branding, the lessons we can learn from Viking history are still relevant today. The Vikings may have used seals as a way to ensure trust, honor, and reputation in their world. But those same concepts remain fundamental to the way we navigate the world today. And in that sense, the Viking seal wasn't just a mark of identity. It was a mark of a culture that understood the power of reputation, the weight of promises, and the value of honor. In the end, the Viking seal was more than just a tool for trade or diplomacy. It was a symbol of who they were and who they aspired to be. It was their legacy, their promise, and their guarantee to the world. As we come closer to the end of this exploration into Viking seals, it's important to slow down and reflect on what we can truly learn from these ancient practices. While the Vikings lived in a world that, on the surface, appears vastly different from our own, the core ideas behind their use of seals carry timeless lessons about trust, legacy, and personal integrity. It's not just the specific symbols or runes that matter. What's crucial is the idea that these seals were a means of binding promises, of forging connections, and of ensuring that one's identity remained intact for generations. Think about how much our lives today are shaped by the idea of making our mark on the world. We may not carve runes into wood, but we are constantly making marks through our actions, our words, our relationships, and even our digital presence. Our personal seals in the modern world are the marks we leave behind, the legacy we create. And much like the Viking trader who handed over their seal to guarantee a trade, we too are constantly seeking to ensure that the promises we make, both big and small, are honored. In the Viking world, the concept of marking a promise wasn't just a formality. It was a sacred act. When a Viking pressed their seal into wax or carved it into stone, they were binding themselves to a code of honor and responsibility. There was no bureaucracy or paper trail to follow. There were no lawyers to enforce the contracts. The seal was everything. If you broke your promise, your honor, your reputation, and your very identity would be at risk. The gods themselves were believed to watch over these promises, making them not just earthly transactions, but spiritual ones as well. The weight of this responsibility can be hard to fathom, but it also offers us an important lesson when we make promises, when we leave our mark on the world. We are responsible for ensuring that we live up to those commitments. It's fascinating to consider how much the Vikings relied on personal integrity as the foundation of their society. Without a written legal system, without complex contracts or institutions to oversee their transactions, the Vikings placed their trust in each other's word and reputation. Your seal wasn't just a mark of ownership. It was a mark of your entire character. In some ways, your seal was more than just a personal guarantee. It was your relationship with the community, with the divina, and with the past. Think of it like this. When you receive a handshake, an agreement, or a promise from someone today, there's often an invisible bond that holds it all together. Something more than the actual words being exchanged. It's trust, We rely on the notion that people will honor their word, and when they do, we mark them as trustworthy. The Vikings, though, didn't have the convenience of modern tools to track promises and deals. Their word, symbolized by their seal, was their ond. Their word was their reputation. This is a simple yet powerful lesson for our world today, where trust seems increasingly fragile and agreements sometimes hinge more on written contracts than on personal honor. Now, we also have to consider how the legacy of the Viking seal lives on through the very nature of modern identity and branding. If you think about how we present ourselves today, through our clothing, our logos, or even how we conduct ourselves in the digital world, you'll see clear echoes of the Viking approach to personal identity. The seal, which was once an individual's mark, now finds its parallel in modern branding and logos. A brand is more than just a product. It's a promise. It's a seal that communicates who you are, what you stand for, and whether you can be trusted. This is just as true for businesses as it is for individuals. Consider the massive global brands we encounter every day: Apple, Nike, and Coca-Cola. These brands aren't just logos or names. They are symbols that promise a certain quality, a certain value system, and a certain experience. The same principles that made the Viking seal such a powerful symbol of trust, identity, and reputation are at work in the branding world today. When you wear a Nike swoosh, for example, you're not just wearing a piece of apparel. You're participating in the legacy and values that the brand has carefully crafted over time. Your seal, whether personal or corporate, says a lot about you. And just as the Vikings were known for their powerful seals, today's brands have worked to cultivate the same kind of recognition and trust among the masses. In the realm of personal branding, the same rules apply when you present yourself in a professional or personal context. Your words, your actions, and the symbols you use convey a sense of who you are and what you stand for. Just as the Viking seals were an extension of their identity, so too are our actions and the symbols we present an extension of our modern selves. And much like a Viking's honor was tied to the reputation they built over their lifetime, our reputations today shape the opportunities we are afforded and the relationships we cultivate. But perhaps the most important lesson we can take from the Vikings and their seals is the recognition of how much identity is shaped by both personal and shared experiences. A Viking seal was never just their own. It was the product of their family, their community, and their relationship with the divine. It was a powerful symbol of connection to something greater than themselves. In today's world, while we may not be carving runes into stone, the symbols we create through our actions, our words, and our digital presence still link us to our families, our communities, and even the ideals we hold dear. Now, as we near the end of this story, it's important to recognize that the Viking seal, this simple yet powerful mark, was not just an ancient artifact. It was a testament to the Vikings' understanding of what it meant to live with integrity, to honor one's word, and to leave a legacy behind. The lessons of trust, reputation, and legacy remain just as vital in our modern world as they were in the Viking Age, whether it's through a personal seal, a corporate logo, or even the promises we make each day. The spirit of the Viking seal lives on, marking the path for future generations, reminding us all that who we are and how we choose to live our lives is, in the end, our most lasting legacy. As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the Vikings and their seals, it's time to reflect on the lasting impact that these ancient symbols have had not only on their own world, but on ours as well. Over the past sections, we've seen how the Viking seal was not just a tool for commerce, diplomacy, or personal identity. It was a deeply meaningful symbol that represented trust, integrity, and connection to the divine. In this final section, we'll bring all these elements together to reflect on the Viking legacy and what we can learn from it today. The Viking seal was, in many ways, a reflection of the Vikings themselves. It was bold, direct, and powerful, a symbol that left an impression wherever it was used. But beneath that powerful exterior lay a deep commitment to honor and reputation. In Viking society, your word was your bond, and the seal was a physical manifestation of that commitment. Whether you were a warrior, a trader, or a king, your seal wasn't just a mark of identity. It was a guarantee that you would live up to the promises you made, no matter the cost. In today's world, the concept of reputation still holds incredible weight. While we no longer carve runes into stone or press seals into wax, the principles that governed Viking life still apply to how we navigate our modern existence. Just like the Viking seal, our personal and professional reputations are built on trust, honesty, and accountability. Whether we are making deals in a boardroom or forming friendships in our personal lives, the promises we make are powerful. They define us, and just like the Vikings, the integrity of our word determines the legacy we leave behind. Think about how we navigate trust in the modern world. When you sign a contract today, whether it's a business deal, a rental agreement, or a wedding vow, you're not just agreeing to specific terms. You're also establishing a connection that relies on the honor and integrity of everyone involved. Your signature, just like a Viking seal, carries weight. It represents not only who you are in that moment, but also your word and your future actions. Just as a Viking seal could carry divine significance, so too does our word hold a sacred responsibility. But the Viking seal wasn't just about making promises. It was also about creating a legacy. When a Viking pressed their seal into a document or passed it to a fellow trader, they weren't just sealing a deal. They were asserting their place in a much larger narrative. The Vikings understood that their actions would outlive them, that their legacy would be carried forward by the symbols they left behind. Whether it was a carved rune or a pressed seal, the legacy of their words would continue to echo through the ages. And this idea of legacy is something that still resonates with us today, whether we realize it or not. The symbols we create in our lives, the choices we make, the people we interact with, and the marks we leave on the world are a reflection of the legacy we hope to leave behind. One of the most striking lessons we can take from the Vikings is their understanding of the interconnectedness of identity, reputation, and legacy. For the Vikings, their personal seal was not just a private mark. It was a bridge to their past, their community, and their gods. It was a symbol that connected them to something larger than themselves. And this idea of interconnectedness is just as relevant today as it was in the Viking Age. We are not isolated individuals. We are part of a vast web of relationships that span generations, cultures, and histories. The actions we take today are the legacy we leave for future generations. Just as the Viking seal carried the memory of their ancestors into the future, in the same way, the modern world places immense value on symbols. Logos, trademarks, and personal brands are more than just visual representations. They are the embodiment of our values, our integrity, and our commitments. A brand like Apple or Tesla isn't just about selling products. It's about representing a set of values, a way of thinking, and a promise to customers. This isn't too different from how the Vikings used their seals. Each seal, whether it was that of a merchant, a warrior, or a leader, carried a message about who that person was, what they stood for, and how they could be trusted. Viking seals, with their carefully crafted runes and intricate designs, were also a form of storytelling. Each seal told a story about the person who owned it, about their lineage, their actions, and their relationship with the divine. Just like today's personal brands or corporate identities, these seals conveyed an entire narrative in a single mark. As we think about our own personal stories, we are reminded of the importance of the marks we leave behind. Whether in our careers, our relationships, or our communities, what do our seals say about us? What story are we telling with the way we present ourselves to the world? Now, as we slowly wind down and reflect on all we've learned, it's important to remember the timeless nature of the lessons the Viking seals offer. They remind us that who we are, what we stand for, and the promises we make are the foundation of our legacy. Our actions, our integrity, and our commitment to honor will live on long after we're gone, whether through a business card, a signature, or the mark of a seal. The promises we make shape the stories that will be told about us in the future. We have the power to leave a legacy of trust, honor, and integrity, just as the Vikings did with their seals. So as we close this chapter, take a moment to reflect on your own seal. What does it look like? What story does it tell? And how will you ensure that your seal, your word, and your legacy stand the test of time? Now, as you slowly drift into sleep, let these thoughts settle with you. Think of the Viking traders, warriors, and leaders who left their mark on the world through the seals they pressed. Let your own dreams be shaped by the power of promises kept and the legacy of integrity that lasts beyond a lifetime.